If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what is a creepy, bone-chilling true story you have, that most people don't know about? I once worked at a youth summer camp in Ohio as a counselor for kids. I arrived early with my best friend to help set up the facilities before the rest of the staff. My friend was in an intense relationship and would often spend hours on the phone with his girlfriend and fall asleep on the couch in the big house at the camp. Now the camp is huge, over about 20 acres, and we had been assigned to sleep in what was called the cage, which was a really old, weird wooden cabin. There was literally no one else at the camp at that point, just the two of us. So I would fall asleep in the cage while my friend was on the phone. Now, I'm not the kind of guy that gets easily freaked out, only because I usually don't realize the severity of the situation until much later. I woke up out of a dead sleep to the sound of children laughing. In the dark. The F. So naturally, what do? I casually get up and go get my friend, a long walk through an unlit field. He had fallen asleep in the main building again. He is half awake and asks me who is laughing. The next day, the rest of the staff arrives, and what do? They start telling ghost stories about the camp and the old director, from 100 years ago or something, and how at night you can still hear his campers, that he murdered, of course, laughing at you. We started to tell the staff about the previous night and what happened, and they freaked out so bad they had to stop. Freaky time. I went to the Myrtles plantation, which is known as very haunted, in St. Francisville, Louisiana. We got to explore the entire grounds alone, my friend and I. Other than a couple rocks thrown at us from nowhere, what looked like a person dancing turned out to be a statue. We walked around for hours, not really seeing anything. Sunrise comes, and she takes a final walk around the lot. Come to a bridge we hadn't seen the night before. And we walked across it, just as I was about to step off the last bit onto the grass. I was looking 90 degrees to my left along a tree line when I saw a dog lying down. It wasn't just black, it was like a cutout of, space-time. Blacker than black. As my eyes scanned left, there was another tree and another dog, as black as the one before, but he was standing facing me. Then another tree and another larger animal. I kept scanning to my left, and between each tree was an animal shaped larger than the last one. Perhaps between 10 and 15 of them. I'm not sure. The second to last animal shape I remember that was now directly in front of me was like 6 feet tall, in the shape of a tiger or something. Then I saw him. He was like 10 feet tall, he was as wide as 3 men, his arms went past his knees, he was also blacker than any earthly black, and he was bowed up like he was mad. His head must have jutted forward because it was just a semicircle, no neck. I just stood there, frozen. I guess I was trying to make sense of what the duck I was looking at. I was trying to look for a face, but there wasn't one. It seemed I was looking into his empty face forever. Then suddenly 2 sideways S of wispy smoke-like forms appeared where the eyes should be, and just as quickly they popped into perfect circles. The only way I can describe what they looked like is when you look at a bubble and you see the rainbow shifting and swirling. It was like that, but shining silver and black swirling. When I saw him, it was as if he was broadcasting the eye. How to describe it? If it wasn't for blank, I would be ducking you up right now, like exactly in those words, but the blank like was censored. Something followed me home as well, but I'll stop here. I worked as a camp counselor. One day off, or rather night, my friend came to me at 12 a.m. and asked if I wanted to come with him into town to grab some late-night Subway. I agreed, and we started driving. In order to get into town, you need to go on a dirt road through the forest until you reach the country road. I was trying to switch the music or something when I heard my friend say duck, and then we proceeded to run over something and stop the car up the road. I say what the duck happened, and we both look in the rearview mirror. We hit some hairy, jet black-haired shit, and it was lying on the ground. We just kind of looked at the rearview mirror for a bit. At first, I thought it was some sort of animal. Then me and my friend proceeded to see it put 2 hands on the ground and stand up, and that's when we decided it was time to get the duck out of there. Speeding down the dirt road until we reached town. I watched as it hunched back into the woods. Creepiest SHT we've both ever seen. We ended up driving way too fast when we returned to camp. We didn't tell anyone when we came back because it all sounded far too surreal, but we knew what we saw. The thing itself wasn't even that big, at least it didn't look big in the rear view mirror. We were 50 to 100 meters up the road. Looked about 3 to 4 feet tall. My wife's family owned cabins along the Delaware River that the whole family would use at different points. We were up there with her cousin and his wife, who are about the same age as us. They get into a fight, and her cousin goes on a walk to cool down while the rest of us are hanging out at the cabin. A few hours go by, and my wife and her cousin's wife are getting worried about him, So they asked me to go check on him before it gets dark. I walked down the dirt road that all of the cabins were on, which is about a mile long, looking for him with no luck. At the edge of the dirt road is a nature preserve with hiking trails. I walk a few feet in and call out for him, and off in the distance I hear a voice say here. So I go in a little farther and call out again, asking him to come back, and all I hear is here off in the distance again. So I'm a little pissed at this point and start walking down the trail where I hear the voice calling, and as I keep calling, it starts to get a little closer. By then it was close to sunset and starting to get dark, so I yelled out one last time to come back to the cabin, and then I heard, "You come here." I'm getting freaked out because of the darkness, so I turn around and head back to the cabin, figuring he's an adult and can take care of himself. When I get back to the cabin, he is sitting there, and they can see the look of astonishment on my face. I tell them about what just happened, and we sit there and wonder if I would have found the source of the voice that was trying to lead me into the woods at night. Was driving from Atlanta, GA to Lexington, SC with my GF to visit my parents. I like to drive at night since there are less people on the road and I can take my time. At around 3 a.m. or so we are making good time. I had stopped at a gas station and picked up some coffee for us and we were due in about an hour. GF was sleeping soundly and I'm listening to a quiet radio humming away. I start getting a little drowsy and take a sip. Road was just as my coffee, no cars in sight except for a spotted few on the side of the road here and there. In the distance I can make out what looks like a hitchhiker, or what I think is one, but can't really tell due to such low light. As I get closer I start to notice other things, like how the person is kinda thin and tall and completely, for the most part, apparently brown. I'm right up on this thing now, and at about 20 feet it turns around and locks eyes with me as I pass by. This was no person. And it is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. It was a deer. Or I tell myself it was. I have seen deer stand on their hind legs to fight, but they still have deer posture when they do. Not only that, but I was watching this thing walk for about 30 seconds from first seeing it in the distance to passing it. The posture it had was human. Standard biped stance. Arms back, chin down. But the worst part was the eyes, or lack thereof. In their place were two large black pits, almost black hole-ish. I'll never forget the stare down it gave me. The instant I passed it I had the only panic attack I've ever had in my life. I had to wake up my GF to keep calm enough to get to an exit with a large gas station a few miles away. Like hell I was going off a ramp close to that thing. After we pulled into the station I had a complete meltdown. I started crying harder than I ever thought I could. I couldn't talk, breath, or do anything but want to curl into a ball and cry. After around 30 minutes or so, she finally gets me to calm down enough to tell her what happened. While I don't think she believed what I think I saw, she knew that I was convinced and legitimately scared to death. Every once in a blue moon I will dream about it and wake up crying or in a cold sweat, and she will tease me about it or roll over and ignore me instead of comforting me about the one thing that I've ever been terrified of. But I know what I saw, and I know it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was camping with some friends. We spent the entire day shooting down wasp nests with our BB guns. At night, we slept in a tent. So thick, you really couldn't see the stars through it. After we had all gotten quiet and started to almost sleep, we saw a bright light appear that we could see through the tent. My friend said it was the moon. He required glasses and was not wearing them when the light appeared, so, all three of us hopped out of the tent. It was just a really bright star in comparison to the others. Suddenly, it started to move. We all laughed and joked about how it could be aliens. Then SHT got real as it got closer and lit up the valley we were camping in. After several thousand swear words, it stopped. For probably 30 minutes or so. Then it split into two. A blue-like flame came out of the back of it, and it shot off across the sky. After that, the other one did the same and headed off in the other direction. We obviously didn't sleep at all that night. To this day, I still have no idea what it was and have never seen anything like it again. My husband was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. It was a chilly late October night as we drove the back roads of rural Pennsylvania. We started climbing a steep hill in her SUV. Just as we crested the hill, some animal or person came jetting out of the woods and flew across the street. The distance covered was at least 50 yards from the woods to the road and back to the woods on the other side. It was the absolute fastest living thing I've ever seen, and it appeared to be on two legs. It was ice white, either because that was its color or because the car lights were bleaching it out. Whatever it was, it moved so fast that I wasn't even sure I saw anything. When I turned to my wife, she looked terrified. I asked her if she saw something, and she described what I just saw. Neither of us thought the other would corroborate what was seen, but when we realized that thing was actually real, Out there in the woods, outside of our car, we got the hell out of there and never drove that route again. I lived in a house from hell for 4 years, from age 11 to almost 16. There was always something happening. Doors flying open and shut, voices, footsteps, nothing ever stays where you put it. I was alone there a lot because both my parents worked, and I was constantly terrified. One of the most gut-level disturbing things, though, was the little girl in my bathroom. Every time I walked past my bathroom door, which was constantly since it was right outside my bedroom, I saw a little girl with blonde curled hair and a rose-colored dress. She just stood there, staring, looking like a photograph from 1905. I started keeping the door closed so I could walk by without seeing her, but she was always there when I opened it. Once I stepped in past her, I couldn't see her anymore, but I could feel her there. She scared me, but I felt really sorry for her because she was trapped there, just like me, but probably forever. As the years went by and things in the house continued to get worse, she started seeming darker. I started feeling like she wasn't really a little girl. I knew there was something ugly in the house, and I felt like it was presenting this sympathetic image to me. Then I started thinking I was completely losing my mind. One day, when I was 14, I had a friend from out of town come stay with me for a week. I hadn't told her anything whatsoever about the house because I didn't think she would come if I did. Right after she got there, we were sitting in my room, and she left to go to the bathroom. About a minute later, she walked back in with a puzzled look on her face and said, "So, there's a little girl in your bathroom?" Yeah, she hangs out in there. Blonde hair? Curls? Pink dress? Yeah. You know that's not really a little girl, don't you? I almost threw up. I was so relieved, terrified, excited, and ready to run out of the house screaming. She wouldn't use my bathroom the rest of the week, and I started using it as little as possible without pissing off my parents, who did not want to believe. Eventually we moved out, and I could not have been happier. I distanced myself from it mentally as much as I could. Then, when I was 18, I took another friend on a road trip to pack up a few things I'd left in the house. My parents hadn't managed to sell it and wouldn't for 5 more years. The minute we got on the property, my friend seemed uncomfortable. When we came around the bend in the long, steep driveway, he went completely white. I could tell something was wrong, but he insisted he was okay, so we got to work. After a while, he asked to use the bathroom, and I directed him to mine. Not 20 seconds after he left, he came running back in, gasping for breath, and slammed the bedroom door behind him. He started babbling about a little blonde girl who isn't really a little girl. All of a sudden he went dead still, looked me in the eye, and very solemnly said, "She's not happy with you. You left, and you weren't supposed to." We threw whatever we could grab in 2 trips in my car, after I walked him to another bathroom and waited outside the door, and got the duck out at top speed. On July 5th, probably 6 years ago now, my friends and I were shooting off some extra fireworks. I live on the north shore of Long Island, right on the Sound, which is pretty hilly, so we had about a 1/4 to half-mile walk on the side of a sand dune cliff thing to a clearing where we could shoot the fireworks. For some context, this is a narrow path with some small brush on the left, about a 100-foot drop, and deep woods to the right. The area on the right of the trail is the woods before the state park, which must be 2 to 3 miles deep at least. It's about 3 a.m., and we're done with the fireworks and start walking back, so now the beach or cliff is on the right and the deep woods are on the left. All of a sudden, we hear some ruffling of leaves and sticks in the woods. Okay, whatever. Plenty of deer in the woods, no problem. We take maybe 10 more steps, and we hear the same noise again, except now it's much closer. We all shut the duck up and pick up the pace a little. 20 feet later, the sound is right on top of us, and a man, probably in his 50s, it was tough to tell because all we had were our cell phones to light up the path, steps out right in front of us. The man is in a brown pinstripe suit with a matching top hat, a black briefcase, and those kinds of glasses that Roosevelt wore. He then said, "Well, good evening, boys. How are you tonight?" We hauled asses and never looked back. I have no idea what the guy was doing, but it still terrifies me to this day. I was walking in the woods once when I saw a blue tent, or what had once been a tent. It was torn to shreds, the poles were snapped, and it was all in a messy pile in the middle of a clearing. From a distance, it looked like this clearing was full of cream-colored flowers, but as I got closer, I realized they were pieces of paper. Pages from Stephen King's The Shining, to be precise. They were charred around the outside as though someone had set fire to them, and the fact that they were individuals made it look like someone had really wanted to destroy the book. I shrugged it off. It was a very neat setup for whatever project the film students from the nearby school would be making, I told myself. Very well done, guys. Very creepy. It made the news shortly afterwards that a man from the next town over who had been missing for a long time had finally turned up. Dead. In his blue tent in the woods. I don't know if he was still in there when I walked past. I don't want to know. I grew up in a small town. My parents' house was about a mile outside town. At night during the summer, I would sneak out and walk into town to see my friends. There is a large golf course between the village and my parents' place, and an old trail through the woods behind it, formerly where a railroad came into town years ago. I would walk that trail as a shortcut and to avoid getting hassled by the local police for being out so late. Bordering the golf course is a huge, abandoned Gothic architecture college that closed down in the 1970s. One night, I was walking home, and I kept hearing leaves crunching behind me on the trail. It's not unheard of, as there are wild animals, and occasionally someone would camp out in the woods without permission. I picked up the pace a little and continued on my way. A few minutes later, the crunching became more consistent and closer. I got a little nervous and decided to cut away from the trail along the golf course and go along the old college. It's less known, and the trail is overgrown, so I figured it was unlikely someone would follow me down there. Everything seemed good. A little later, I walked by an old, boarded-up entrance to the college. I had been there plenty before, and it never seemed spooky during the day. This time, all the boards had been broken off the doorway and were in pieces on the ground. If you look up Bennett College Abandoned on Google, you can see photos of this place. There was no way I was going inside. I cut back towards the golf course and started walking faster. A little while later, the noise started again, to my side in the woods. It was louder now, and it was continuous. There was no break in the noise. There was no pause between footsteps. Just a continuous dragging noise. I started jogging across the golf course. When I got close to the road by my house, I heard a noise. It sounded like someone was laughing quietly. I looked back towards the trail, and in the moonlight, I could see something standing there in the grass. I could only see its silhouette, but it was thin and tall. Too tall for any person. It had bizarrely long arms and legs. Then it started moving towards me, and I turned around and ran home screaming. When it moved, I swear, its legs didn't bend at the knee like a person's would. I don't even know how to describe it. Later on, I would compare the shape to Jack the Pumpkin King or, more recently, the Slender Man. But this happened in the mid-90s, before such things. My grandmother told me the story of two hitchhikers on a road late one night. So the story goes that my grandmother was driving her car one night when she was about 16 years old. It was an elderly man and woman standing by the side of the road. She felt compassion for them, so she just decided to pick them up. She said the whole trip felt a bit odd, and the older woman had a wide-brimmed hat that every once in a while she would look up at in an odd way. As she rode with them, the more uncomfortable she became, so as soon as she could, she said this was as far as she was going and let them out. No harm, no foul. The next morning, her father was sitting at the breakfast table reading his morning paper. When she entered the room, he said to her, "Marjorie, I sure am glad you are smarter than some out there and that you never pick up hitchhikers." Smugly under her breath, she uttered, "Oh, if you only knew." It was just at that moment that her father turned around the paper on the front cover and saw the couple she had picked up the night before. Apparently the gentleman had helped his wife escape from the local Asian asylum, and the next person who felt compassion for them picked them up and hacked them into little bitty pieces. A friend of mine works with a backpacking company that takes groups of people out for week-long trips in the Colorado Rockies and told me this. One time she was going to scout out a new mountain they'd just gotten access to find good places for high and low camp, good routes, etc. She planned for it to just be a day trip, but she took her full pack with the tent just in case, since it was an unmarked forest and she didn't totally know where she was going to be or for how long. So she's up in the forest by herself, taking pictures and documenting stuff. I don't really know how this all works, basically trying to find good routes and locations. Eventually it gets darker, and she decides to set up camp around halfway up the mountain. All is well, she gets up the next morning and heads back to civilization. Later that day, she's with her boss, telling him about where she went, etc. She's scrolling through the pictures on her camera to show him, and then they get to the last three. The last three pictures on her camera are of her sleeping in her tent. She was hiking alone, miles away from any civilization or even hiking trails. Literally out in the boonies. But somehow someone else was up there with her, found her tent during the night, and took 3 pictures of her while she was sleeping. It's freaky because she said there were no signs that she saw to indicate anyone else being up there. Only a few other people actually knew what she was doing and where, and they were all doing other things that day, so it wasn't them. An actual stranger did it. When I was a little kid, I had a reoccurring nightmare almost weekly. I would be in the basement and hear a meow. I would search for the source in the dark and find it in a sunken window at eye level with a little bit of filtered light. Lying in it would be a dead gray cat with empty eye sockets fixed on me, giving a mournful shriek. Sometimes a red light would open in my eye, and everyone I loved would die. I would wake up at various stages of this nightmare. It got so bad one summer that I slept with the lights on all night. Every time I heard a cat, I was afraid it was the eyeless gray one from the nightmare. Fast forward 25 years, and I am buying my first home with my wife. It doesn't have central air, so we sleep downstairs in the basement for the summer. We have one of those sunken windows. One night the first week there, we woke up to the sound of a cat meowing and furiously trying to get into the bedroom through the sunken window. In the filtered light, I see a gray cat, and I see an empty eye socket staring back at me. We've slept upstairs since. But, in a twist, the cat is lovely. His name is Lou, and he runs beside me when I go for a jog. He also plays with our new Australian Shepherd puppy. The most social cat I've ever seen. I broke into an abandoned hospital in the middle of the city. Weird, right? There were about 10 of us. Anyways, we brought those little family band radios, and we split off into two groups, the first exploring the bottom 5 floors, including the basement, and my group exploring from the top down, and we would meet wherever in the middle. The place is probably somewhere in the 2 million square foot range, and we wanted to cover it all as a group. So we go about our exploring and meet wherever on the 6th or 7th floor. We're all standing there next to the elevator shaft talking about stuff we've come across and are about to leave when all of a sudden our radios start crackling. And not the losing signal type of crackling, like if you turn on an AM radio in a thunderstorm. It goes on for about 2 or 3 minutes and then stops. So my friend Tanner looks at me, and I ask him what frequency he's on. Channel 4. I look at mine, and I'm on channel 2. I must have bumped it in my pocket or something. But that still doesn't explain why it was happening to both of our radios. So he pipes up into his radio, "Hello?" Nothing. He tries again. The crackling starts again, and you can vaguely and faintly, but clearly, hear what sounds like one of those metal medical carts crashing and a girl screaming, "No! No! Help me!" And a man goes, "We're trying to help you." Then it stops. So he tries one last time, and then it stops all of a sudden, and it sounds like someone has clicked on a mic on another radio. I still get nightmares about the next part. All of a sudden, silence, and then "I've found you" comes over the radio, and then across the room, the place is being actively demolished, so there are no walls except load-bearing, the most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard, as well as the elevator, for which the building has no power whatsoever, starts dinging, and you hear the elevator go whizzing past and bottom out with a nice thud, which probably sounded like a bomb exploding. We got the duck out of there, and I refuse to even go within visual distance now. It turns out it used to be a federally run hospital that was notorious for human experimentation on TB patients, and there is a good chance that the girl heard was a girl who a lot of people have heard of there. The story goes that she was a nervous wreck and would chew her fingernails to the bone, so in an effort to stop her, they removed her fingernails. Keep in mind that this hospital hasn't been open for at least 20 years. My father once told me a story of when he was younger, in his 20s, I believe, about the holy souls of purgatory. Every night before he went to bed, he would say a prayer for the holy souls of purgatory. One day he walked over to his friend's house, which was about a mile or so away. There was a get-together going on, so he decided to bring along his boombox. Well, the party winds down, and my dad decides to walk home alone. The path he had taken was a little dirt path through some woods. On his way back, he was confronted by a group of thugs. He said there were at least 5 of them. The thugs were looking to steal my dad's boombox. At this time in his life, my father had been studying martial arts and had struck a fighting pose. He said that instantly they went pale and just ran away. Several days pass by, and he is chilling at some local bar with friends when he overhears a guy telling a story about the guy with the boombox that they had tried to rob. From what my father told me, the guy said something along the lines of, "Yeah, we saw the guy walking by himself, and we were going to rob him. But out of nowhere, like 9 or 10 people showed up. Like they just appeared from thin air." He swears to this day that the people that showed up were the holy souls of purgatory coming to his aid. My dad has never been one to spin tales and is a fairly serious person, so when he told me a story like this, it really creeped me out. It was over spring break this year, 2002, and I was in NC like always to see family and a few old friends. My uncle is in a band, and they practice on his farm in a barn turned almost into a mini recording studio. On his farm, there are about 50 acres, guesstimation, of uncleared land that has trails cut through it just enough to fit a Chevy Spectrum through. Trees skim the side doors, but that's another story. Anyway, one of the trails is about a half-mile long and goes from the barn to a creek that runs through his property. One day, we went into the woods. As soon as we got to the trail that goes to the creek, we saw a path as wide as a small truck full of broken trees. The tree trunks were literally snapped in the middle like a tornado had come through. It looked like a twig would if a human snapped it in half. It was physical proof that what was down there wasn't human. This summer, my friend Dave and I went to my uncle's and had a field party. A bunch of chicks showed up, so we walked about 20 feet into the woods on the trail as I told the story. I got halfway through it, and Dave pulled out, "Oh my God, look over there," and pointed. The girls freak out, and he turns to console them while I look frantically for what he was pointing at. Then I see it, a figure, like before, standing in the moonlight near a tree, the eyes staring at us. I began to back up and tried to get the words out to tell everyone to run. Finally, I got outrun, and everyone was confused at first until I got my senses to begin yelling commands. Dave turned around and saw that he had actually pointed something out, and he freaked as well. We all sprinted out of the woods and made it to the barn, where the cars and alcohol were. The girls were shaking and crying, wanting to know if we had just scared them or if there really was something. I told them they didn't want to know, so they got scared and left once I finished the story. Dave and I stayed to clean up the mess. The girls said they might be back later if we were still there, so being the horny 18-year-olds that we were, we decided to sit in my car and wait around for a while since nothing had popped up on the edge of the woods since we had run out. 1:00 a.m. rolled around, and Dave and I were getting tired, and the girls hadn't shown back up. That's when we decided to go to sleep in my car. I didn't have my eyes closed long at all when Dave sat up and said, "Listen to that." It got really quiet all of a sudden. He was right, all the crickets and noises you hear on a summer night had stopped all at once. Then the howling came and the light at the barn went off. We had both gotten drunk since the woods incident. We were sober when we went in, and couldn't leave my uncle's place, so we moved my car over to his driveway at his house. We sat there freaking out for a while but managed to fall asleep. Our sleep was short-lived. Only an hour after we dozed off, Dave woke up out of nowhere and began to shake me. He was freaking out and looking everywhere. He brought it to my attention that it had gotten quiet again. He looked over his shoulder to the woods and then was brought back to look at me. I was hyperventilating. Across the street, on top of a house, was a figure crouched in a squatting position. It had red eyes, like the things in the woods. Dave got me to my senses, and I gunned it out of the driveway and onto the road. We got onto the road, and I was smack in the middle when something slapped the passenger side mirror against the car. There was nothing I could have hit in the middle of the road. We drove around till sunrise and parked in the mall parking lot to sleep for a few hours. I don't think I'll ever go back to those woods at nightfall again. I used to work at a ranch in rural Michigan, about 2,000 acres, which is big for the mitten. Sometime around 2000, I was too young at the time to remember exactly, a local newsreader's daughter was kidnapped and hadn't been found for many months. One day in November, two of the men who would later be my bosses were deer hunting, and they crossed 50 feet beyond the property line following a wounded buck. Supposedly, it was a foggy day and the sun was going down, but the guy who oversaw me directly tripped on what he thought was a root. It turned out that he tripped over her tibia and landed on her body. After a thorough police investigation, it was determined that she was held on one of our disused campsites through the winter, but being an area that is closed 10 months a year, no one had been back there. His son later told me he still wakes up screaming in his sleep after nightmares of falling onto her corpse, and a lot of people have reported seeing the ghost of a young girl on the site where she was held. That campsite still gives me a palpable sense of dread. That said, there are myriad ghost stories on the ranch. It's supposed to be one of the most haunted places in the state. So this story takes place in the early 2000s, when I was a teenager. My cousin had just had a baby, and her husband was called out for a job that would take a couple of weeks. My cousin asked if I would stay with her for 2 weeks to help her with the baby and work around the house. I was there for a few days, and everything was pretty uneventful, until the middle of the second week. At night we would hear someone knocking on different sides of the trailer. Keep in mind the nearest neighbor was about 5 miles away. This continued for 3 nights in a row. The 4th night is when things take a turn for the worst. The night starts with knocking, but it progresses to scratching. Worried that someone was trying to break in, I summoned the courage to go outside and confront whatever or whoever was messing with us. I only caught a shadow of whatever it was as it ran behind the trailer. I ran around yelling at it, "You better run because I'm going to call the cops." Or something to that extent. It is so fast, I cannot believe it. As I chase it to the front of the trailer, it runs through the clothesline. This is where it gets even crazier. It ran towards a utility post, climbed up it, clutching something in its hands, and began the most airy laugh I have ever heard. It jumps back down, dropping whatever it was holding, and runs towards the window of the trailer, as if to peek in. My cousin was inside, holding the baby. I ran to the window and looked, and to my amazement, it had disappeared. I run inside and tell my cousin it is gone. Needless to say, we didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside and looked out the window where I had last seen it. I look at the ground and see bare footprints. However, these were not ordinary footprints. The best way I can describe it is as a human footprint with claws, like a dog or wolf. I went to the utility pole and found what it had been clutching the night before. It was my niece's tiny little shirt. It goes without saying that we spent the next few days in the safety of my mother's home off the res. This event occurred when I was 7 years old, during the summer of 1968. At the time, we lived in an old farmhouse about a quarter-mile from an old church cemetery in southeast Wisconsin. I visited this cemetery on most days with my dog, Taffy. I would puzzle out the inscriptions on tombstones more than 100 years old, climb trees, and generally have a good time for a 7-year-old. I should also mention here that in the southeast corner of the cemetery, there was a collection of 4 rectangular tombstones laid flat on the ground in an open area. While I knew every corner and stone of the place, strangely, something always made sure I would never go over there. I never had any odd feelings or felt any threat, but whenever I approached that area, something would always distract me from going there. It was early August, and for some reason I got the crazy idea to go to that cemetery at night to see if I could spot a ghost. I was so used to the cemetery that I wasn't afraid, I just thought it was a neat thing to do. So on a moonlit night, after being put to bed, I managed to sneak out of the house and bring Taffy with me. I never had to keep Taffy on a leash, she would always dutifully stay within about 100 feet of me no matter where I went. When I got to the cemetery, I tempted fate by jumping on tombstones with the hopes of insulting some ghosts. I stopped and waited. Nothing happened. Only the sounds of crickets and Taffy nearby in the tall grass looking for mice broke the silence. I then stomped on the graves themselves, demanding loudly to be haunted. I waited. Nothing continued to happen. And Taffy still couldn't find a mouse, not even a ghost one. I eventually gave up, was disappointed, and went back home. 2 nights later, I returned. As before, I stomped on some graves and demanded to be haunted. Taffy was poking around within sight, a few yards away. What happened next is a bit hard to describe. I was facing the corner of the cemetery I never went into. In one instant, the crickets stopped, and the air above that corner seemed like it froze then cracked. Taffy was instantly alert, then immediately bolted away. A fraction of a second later, I followed, running faster than I had ever run in my life. We were both headed for the house, and I somehow knew that something was in the air above, chasing me. I actually beat the dog back to the house. Inside I slammed the door, and I sensed that this thing was flying around and around the whole outside of the house. Now I hear this terrible, panicky growl and scratching at the door. Taffy was still outside. I opened the door and let her in, and she wrapped herself around my legs, shivering. I couldn't walk without tripping over her. At this point, my mother comes down and wants to know, what on earth am I doing? And stops mid-sentence when she notices the dog shaking between my legs. She knew something was up, the house we lived in had its own troubles, and told me to get back to bed. I actually felt calm and no longer felt any presence outside at all. I slept soundly. Needless to say, I never asked to be haunted again. When I was about 8 or 9, my family lived in a house in a little hidden neighborhood on a cul-de-sac. It had a huge backyard, but there was a rusted-out trailer, the flat kind you use to tow dirt bikes and whatnot, in one corner of the yard. That area of the yard always gave us the creeps, so we never went over there, and neither did our dog. My 2 younger sisters shared a room, but they would come sleep in my room every once in a while because they said there were weird lights in their room. My parents passed it off as the street lights bothering them. One night, I woke up to this weird feeling of anger. It was like when you're standing next to someone who is murderously pissed at you. There was a silhouette of a person standing in the doorway and a single red glowing light like the cherry of a cigarette. Both my parents smoke, so I thought it was one of them. I sat up and said, "Mom? Dad?" But there was no response, and then the figure and the red light were gone. I pulled the covers over my head as quickly as possible and made myself into a tight little ball. Then there was a tug at the blankets at the bottom of the bed. I pulled the blankets back, and there was another tug. I was terrified and unable to move, so I just held on to the blankets as hard as I could. The tugging stopped, but I was frozen with fear. Eventually, I fell asleep again. When I asked my parents about it in the morning, both of them said they were asleep the entire night and it must have just been a nightmare. Fast forward some 20 years, I used to have nightmares about the house, but especially the corner of the garage turned den, which looked like a black hole in my dreams. It was a one-story house, but I used to have dreams of running down the stairs into the den, where I knew if I went close to the black hole that something evil would get me. I also had dreams about other houses in the neighborhood being evil, and if I went to them for help, I would die. My younger sister and I were talking about the house with our mom one night, and she described having almost the exact same nightmares, but we had never spoken about it before. In her dreams, she would run down the stairs into the kitchen, where the cupboards would be opening and closing by themselves. There would also be a man standing in the den near where I would see the black hole. Needless to say, all three of us were pretty creeped out. I've been by the house a few times and still get this eerie feeling when I come into the neighborhood. Maybe it was built on an Indian burial ground. It happened to my dad, not me. When my dad was growing up, there was this house that was kind of off the grid that faced the creek and woods on one side and this long winding trail on the other side, with those large first-story windows in the living room and such, so you could see what was going on inside the house if you were on the trail side. The only person that lived in that house was this typical crazy cat lady, who really didn't talk to anyone or go outside. My dad and his friends would ride their bikes on the trail every single day, past the house, and see the old lady doing normal things like watching TV and such through the large windows. Eventually, things started to get strange with that house. My dad and his friends would ride by and see the old woman sitting in the same position for the entire week, just sitting there. He and his friends would ride by the next day, and she would be sitting or standing somewhere else but still not moving. One day my dad rode by and she was sitting in a rocking chair just facing the wall, and the next he rode by with his friends, and now she was sitting in the same chair but now facing the windows. Everyone swore that her eyes seemed to follow them, but she was unmoving. Eventually a foul smell started coming from the house, and every time my dad and his friends rode by, she seemed to be sitting closer and closer to the window in that chair. Another day, my dad was just walking and past that house. He swears the door was open, and he heard something like a kitten meowing but in pain. When he walked by that window, the old woman was sitting down in her chair and moved her head to look at him the entire time until he passed. Dad and his friends never told anyone because this was the early 1970s and you only spoke to your parents if it was important, and telling ghost stories could get you a whooping for wasting your parents' time. This continued for about a month until a firefighter and his wife were walking by that house, and the smell got so bad that he decided to call some people in and take a look. They found the old woman in her chair dead and all the cats she lived with dead around the house. According to the autopsy they did, she had been dead for almost 2 months up to that point, so that means when my dad and his friends walked or rode their bikes by her house, they were looking at a dead woman who moved. Her son, who grew up in that house, came back after they removed her body and started talking a bunch of stuff about how a demon lived in that house named Charles, who had the appearance of an African slave in chains but the legs of a goat. He was written off as trying to gain something out of her death because he was a hippie into the whole drug scene and largely ignored, though. The house was later torn down, and the whole area was converted into a hiking and dog walking trail. We live in different cities now, but my dad still refuses to walk or go anywhere near that trail because he still gets bad vibes from it. My sister's family got stationed in a rural area of Colorado. They moved into this really cool house surrounded by fields and trees, pretty far from roads and other houses. Fast forward like 6 months, and I'm visiting with my mom during my summer break. When we got there, my sister tried to spook me out by saying the house was haunted. At night, something moves things and whispers, and you might even see it in the corner of your eye. Oh, and you're sleeping alone in the living room, she said, but she'd always liked scaring me, so I brushed her off. It's time for bed now, and my 7-year-old nephew is adamant I don't sleep in the living room. The scary man comes out at night. Sometimes he comes in my room and just watches me. Sure, kid, go tell your mom how funny she is. I'll sleep like a baby, trust me. That is, until I wake up at 2 a.m. to rustling in the kitchen. I'm a little spooked, but I figure it's someone in the family, so I call out. A cabinet slams shut, and there's dead silence, so I get up and peek in. It was totally empty, and the only way out of the kitchen is the doorway to the living room, so I WTF pretty hard and spent the rest of the visit sleeping with my mom. 2 months later, my sister tells us what had really been going on. A homeless guy had been living in the attic for months and was using the attic access holes to move around the house at night. The scariest part turned out to be my nephew's words, sometimes he just watches me. Ligag. There's a small graveyard near my home in Michigan. About 2 years ago, a group of my friends and I went ghost hunting there. It was a warm night with clear skies, and I was raring to catch a ghost on my friend's camera or tape recorder. Even a cell phone video would do. The cemetery is less than an acre, so it didn't take long to scope it out. We broke into groups of 2 and 3 and traversed the grounds. I wandered with a few people, changing from group to group. I felt restless. Usually when we were ghost hunting, we cracked wise, but nobody was saying much. A group near a tall monument, at least 7 feet high and shrouded in vines, called us over. There seemed to be a cold spot about the size and shape of a very tall man. I waved my hands through the air. It did feel a bit cooler, but that could have been my imagination. Everyone began taking pictures, claiming they could see a figure in the digital photos. I hung near the back of the group, not seeing anything. I still felt disquieted. I didn't want to be here. That was when a cold shock squeezed my hand, right between the web of flesh between my right thumb and forefinger. I cried out, yanking my hand away. It hurt. The cold radiated slowly off my hand, and I retreated towards the gate. I'm out. Something grabbed me. I'm out. I was quickly followed by the rest of the party, not so much because of my encounter, but because no one wanted to be in there anymore. It wasn't until the morning that the bruise showed up. Deep in the meat of my hand, not a bad bruise, not bad enough to turn black and blue, but definitely there. Yellow and painful, right in the spot where I'd been grabbed by that cold hand. I haven't been back. I was driving from Boston to upstate New York with a guy who had his GPS set to shortest distance rather than fastest route. We were on weird back roads rather than highways. It was broad daylight, but the road was in a heavily wooded area. It's also worth noting that the guy was notoriously a poor driver and was always 15+ miles over the speed limit. So okay, we're speeding through these woods, and we don't see another car for miles. All of a sudden, and I have not had this feeling before or since, I am beyond all doubt that there is a ghost in the back seat of the car. If you want to push for details, I would have said that she was about 12 with long, dark hair. I start freaking out because, I need you to believe me on this, there was a ghost in the car. For once in his life, the driver slows down. It's in reaction to me freaking out. All of a sudden, the wooded road ends dramatically on a hairpin turn. If we hadn't slowed down, the car would have gone straight over. As we drove by, we could see the wreckage of another car being slowly towed up. The ghost vanished. One night a while back, a car hit a power box outside my town, and a good portion of a residential area close by my house blacked out. My sister and I decided that going for a walk through the powerless neighborhood sounded like a good idea. So we walked a bit before noticing that it was pretty quiet. My town wasn't one where residents would go outside and talk to neighbors about the lack of electricity. There weren't even any signs of people using other methods of light in their houses, candle flickers, flashlight beams, etc. No cars were driving by or anything. Then we swear we heard a police siren whoop and what sounded like someone talking over an intercom in the distance. It kind of weirded us out because we're sissies, so we decided to head back home. A street or so later, she took out her phone to text someone, and for whatever reason, she decided to do the voice text thing. She forgot what she was going to say, so she paused. It was dead quiet, no one was around, I wasn't not talking, she was trying to think, and the voice thing on the phone made a sound or whatever, so we looked down at it, and it had typed out, "I've been watching you." One early morning, about 6 years ago. It was around 3 a.m. My dog was in his cage and was whimpering like he needed to use the bathroom. That woke me up, so I got out of bed and took him outside to pee. My house at that time was surrounded by trees on all sides except for the side that the road was on. I took my small dog to the left side of our house, facing the woods. As he was doing his business, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye from the wooded area behind my house. Immediately, my heart started beating faster. I've already started backing up. In the shadows, I could see this hunk of black, blacker than the shadows. Seemingly on all fours, I started to imagine a dog, but as it moved closer, I noticed it was too round or fat for that. I'm now really scared because it's moving faster, and suddenly, this shadow seems to get out of a crouch position to stand up and begin to flail its limbs as it's running towards me. This is my ducking breaking point. I'm losing it. I'm pulling my dog to get him to pee faster. I squint my eyes and rub them, and when I open them, the shadow is gone. Didn't stop me from running inside ASAP. Children of the Corn. When I was 16, a group of friends and I decided to go camping in the northern peninsula of Michigan. We packed our car and headed out. We had found a camping ground that was in the middle of nowhere and thought that it would be great to get away from the towns and cities. No electronics, no bathing, just pure camping. We got to the campground and set up our sights. We wanted some marshmallows for the fire we were going to have and some hot dogs to roast, so me and a couple of my friends piled into my car and started to go to town. The town is 30 minutes away, give or take, We arrived at the store in the little town, grabbed our stuff, and had some beer. On our way back to the campsite, we passed through a lot of corn fields. We were on the topic of the movie Children of the Corn. As they were all talking, I was making a left on a rundown gravel road to the campsite by a long cornfield. As soon as we turned the corner, we all saw a small child, maybe 9 or 10, in this old, raggedy clothing, and we freaked the duck out. Mind you, there are no houses near this place, and we are maybe 8 to 9 miles away from our campground. We were out in the middle of butt-duck nowhere. No cars around, nothing. I sped up and kicked up dust behind my car. I got back to the campsite, and we all packed our shit and left. We stayed in a hotel after traveling back into the southern part of Michigan. To this day, that is the creepiest, weirdest, and yet ironic thing to happen to me. I was born and raised in North Dakota. Back when I was in high school, a group of us would research murders that occurred out in the county. We would then go out to find the scenes and film the exploration at night. This was about 2 years before Blair Witch. It was something to do while we got wasted on shitty beer and teenage bullshit. Eventually we ran out of places to go. North Dakota equals few people, few murders, and got really good at finding abandoned rural farmsteads by driving dirt roads and looking for the signs. Rut roads, deliberate tree groves, and old mailbox posts were common markers. We were out looking when we spotted a tree grove that was out of place, a sure sign, drove through the field, and discovered an old, but not too old, house. It had padlocks on the outside doors that were knocked off pretty easily. We dispatched them and entered the kitchen. There were 6 of us, all with flashlights, and we lit up the kitchen and dining area fairly easily. The table was the first thing you noticed, and it was strange because of how normal it looked. It was set for a meal, and not a bowl was out of place. The only thing was, we'd been in dozens of these houses, and place setting was a first. Especially unbroken ones. As we investigated the area, we found the fridge had the disgusting remnants of a full stock, and the cupboards were full of canned and dry foods. This was also a first. One guy found mail on the counter from early June 1978, and another found a creepy TV guide in the living room with UFOs on the cover. All the family photos were hanging up. Mom, Dad, Bro, and Sis in their 1970s glory. The furniture was dusty but in good condition. Closets were full. Everything was totally normal. Which was super abnormal. As we dug around the house, we all started to realize that this house had not been moved out of. It had been straight up abandoned. Imagine locking the door to your house and never coming back. That's the state this house was in. Complete, unplanned departure. We went upstairs and split into 3 pairs to check out the 3 rooms. Ours was the closest, and obviously it was the younger boy's room. I can't describe what it looked like too well because, almost right away from the hall, we heard the most ducking terrifying scream I've ever had the misfortune of hearing. We went running into the hallway and were all yelling questions at each other at the same time. After a few, really long seconds, the 2 screamers caught their breath and said, "You have to go in and see." Walking down the hall and through the doorway, I prayed I wouldn't act like a pussycat in front of my friends. I shouldn't have been concerned because the others were as scared as I was. The room itself opened up to the left of the doorframe, and centered on the right side of the room was a queen-sized bed. Propped up on pillows, with the blanket drawn to the waist, arms on top of the blanket, and worst of all, a head turned slightly so it was looking you straight in the eyes when you entered the room, was a life-sized porcelain doll. Snow white skin, jet black hair, and cold, dead eyes. The dead eyes lit up with our flashlights. Like she was waiting for us. If the head hadn't been turned, I could excuse it, but it was turned. Ready for when we walked in. Ready for 20 years. Hasty exits were made down the stairs and into the car. It was during the ride that we started to get even more creeped out when we realized that even though the house had been abandoned, someone had taken the time to set up that goddamn doll. Not packing food, clothes, or family photos. Setting up the doll was one of the last things done in this house. We researched their names but found nothing. There was no tragic car accident. No grisly massacre, no extended family, just a tacky time capsule in the middle of nowhere. We found out that the county had taken possession of the land for non-payment of taxes, explaining the locks, but never tracked down any more information on what happened to them. Or why they left that ducking doll. It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have said good night, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling, since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark and because it was getting quite late. He ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsals of the story, the female would say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the killer. In response to a question asking him to describe the time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into his body and, for some reason, just turn around and walk away.